Hello, friends. Welcome to Equip Kingdom. This is where we come together each and every week to dig deep into God's Word, to learn about who He is, who we are in Jesus, and how we live in His kingdom. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today we're going to be continuing in Mark 6, looking at verses 30 to 44. And if you're familiar with that, you already know that this is one of 4 accounts of one of the greatest miracles that we learn about in the Gospels. And so I'm already excited. I hope you are too, to dig deep. Let's give praise to God, and then we can begin to study His Word. Holy Spirit, I pray that you lead us into your truth today. Guide us in the way that we should go. I pray that you bless the hearing of this word, Lord, that you give us a deeper insight into who you are and why you came to do what you did. I pray that you bless the reading of this word as well, so that you may be glorified in it, and that we may understand better what it means to be a citizen in your kingdom and a disciple who chases after you. We give you all the praise, all the glory, all the might that you deserve. In the mighty name of Jesus, amen. So last time, if you were with us, you know that we studied the birthday feast of Herod Antipas, who of course is the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. Galilee being where Jesus spends most of the beginning of his ministry, in, well, the first half of Mark anyway. And you know that John the Baptizer is executed by Herod Antipas, but through the manipulations of Herod's wife, Herodias. Now, Mark had interrupted Jesus' commissioning of the 12 apostles to be sent out on mission in order to show us the high cost of being a disciple, which John the Baptizer pays. Now, we begin our time today by picking up with the return of the disciples, the other side of the sandwich, in Mark 6, verses 30 to 32. The apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. Now, verse 30, the first verse that I just read, it's a bridge verse, just like what we saw earlier with Jesus in the second half of Mark 6:6. So in that case, Jesus was amazed at the lack of faith in Nazareth, and so he goes out immediately and goes from village to village preaching. So we see kind of that same bridge taking place here. Now we have Antipas's lack of faith that has been that end space that is then bridged by the apostles returning. So we know that Mark tells us that the apostles returned to be in Jesus' presence and report on the mission. Now, this is the only time in Mark's gospel that he identifies the 12 as apostles. And the point of this designation is not to set them apart as being special within Jesus' circle of disciples. Instead, it really is a description of Jesus' commission of the 12 to be apostles, to be sent out, because apostle means to be a delegate, a messenger, one who is sent out with orders. And those who are sent out are always expected to return to be with the one who sends them, in this case Jesus, and report, which is what they do. Remember what it means to be a disciple. It means to be with Jesus, to be in fellowship with Jesus, and also being willing to be sent out in order to fulfill the will of God. And so the apostles are doing both of those things in this time. And really, this is an important designation because this time the people are coming to where Jesus and the disciples are because of the mission work of the 12. Their mission caught the attention of many people. So many people, as Mark tells us, that they're coming and going in waves. There are people who are continually being in front of the disciples, and you just know that they aren't used to that. So what happens here is we see this multiplication, right? So Jesus has multiplied his message, the preaching of the kingdom and what the kingdom is like, through the 12. And so the people are like a harvest, right? They're likewise being multiplied. And we're meant to understand that there are way more people here than usual, than the crowds that Mark explains or describes in earlier accounts of Jesus. So Mark uses a different word here. The word for crowds is oklos, But the sheer mass of people who are here now, who are coming and going in waves, they're called polloi. You may have heard of hoi polloi, right? So we talked about how that crowds had gathered to hear Jesus teach on the lake when he was in the boat. And if you remember, they had done studies on that and found that 2,000 to 3,000 people could have easily been on the shores while Jesus is in the boat and seen and heard him with perfect clarity. Now we have a mass, and the mass is much larger than the crowd. Well, this takes all of the disciples' attention, and so they're not able to break away and refresh themselves, right? They don't even have time to eat. Jesus then directs the 12 to go with him to a quiet place to rest. Now, the quiet place, it describes the same place, or the same type of place at least, where Jesus adjourns to spend time with the Father very early in Mark 1, verse 35. The solitary place is also the same type of place where Jesus is driven. If you remember, a leper comes to Jesus, and Jesus is like, okay, I don't want you to tell anyone about this. You need to keep this to yourself, but instead go and present yourself to the priest. And the leper disobeys because the leper's super excited to be among people again. And so Jesus instead is driven into the wilderness, right? He exchanged places with the leper. And that word is the same here as well, where Jesus is inviting the 12 to go. So the language is exactly the same in the Greek as we see over and over again. And if you remember what I said very early on in Mark, I said there is no specific word for desert or wilderness. It's all kind of the same lonely concept, like this lonely place. It's eremos. And that means isolated or secluded or lonely or desolate or the wilderness. And topos means place. So in that Jesus is inviting them to go to this lonely, secluded, isolated, wilderness, desert place. They all mean the same thing. There are several really cool truths that I want to share with you. First, we see a truth about the invitation of what it means to be on mission with Jesus. The greater the demands of the mission, the greater the essential need to spend time alone with Jesus. I can testify to that completely on my own. As disciples, we are expected to separate from the world and connect with God. And so Jesus has modeled this for us early on, and now he invites the 12 to do so with him. And by extension, he invites you to do that with him as well. Second, this reinforces how the wilderness is the place where God meets with his chosen in fellowship and provision. And this is really going to be so central to how we're going to talk about this today. We're going to dig really deep into this second part, that the wilderness is a place of where God separates us from the world to be in fellowship with him and to provide for us. Third, we are going to be returning to God's promise in the wilderness that he originally gave to the Israelites in Exodus. So we're talking about the promise of rest in the wilderness. And yes, provision is a part of that rest for sure, but there's more. There's a bigger invitation to trust God, to guide us, and to trust in his protection, and to trust in his revelation that he will give us, and to lead us in perfect faithfulness that really goes against what the environment says should be. And we know that the wilderness is a pass-through place on the way to the promised land. We're not meant to stay there, just as the Israelites were not meant to stay there. But it's in the wilderness that it's a very special place with God, and it's where we receive that fellowship that is revealed as the only way that we can survive and thrive. It's with God. He puts us in this space. He puts the disciples in this space. He put his people in this space where they had really little else to distract them from him, right? They look to him to survive. They look to him to thrive. And so it's this setting where it's uncomfortable to be there, but essential to know who God is. So if God's people can rest in God's faithfulness in this most hostile environment, where rest should be unexpected and provision certainly uncertain, then they can trust him in any environment, in any situation. And you know that has applications for us as well. Now, Mark then tells us that Jesus and the 12, they got into the boat and they traveled to an unknown place. Luke 9 verse 10 tells us that they go to Bethsaida. Here's a map of the area that's around the sea, or lake. It's a lake, but it's called the Sea of Galilee, of course. As you can see, Bethsaida would only be a short distance by boat. There are two locations, as you can see here, that are identified as Bethsaida, and Luke is referring to Bethsaida Julius, which is located on the northeast side of the lake. Just as an additional point of context, this part of the region is outside of Herod Antipas's territory. This is technically in Herod Philip II's territory. Now, Jesus may be looking to withdraw from Antipas's region, having just learned from John the Baptizer's followers about John's execution. In any case, Jesus and the 12 would have remained in the uninhabited area away from the town. Now, John, who's one of the 12 who joins Jesus on this trip, he also lets us know that the Passover festival is coming up just in a few days in John 6, verse 4. So that lets us know that we're in springtime when all this takes place. As I said very early on, what happens next is this shows up in all four gospel accounts, and that should tell you that this encounter is central to understanding Jesus' messianic ministry. If you want to go look, you can find the parallel accounts in Matthew 14, verses 13 to 21, Luke 9, verses 10 to 17, and John 6, verses 1 to 15. Now, the masses who have been drawn out by the mission work of the 12, they definitely notice that these 13 men take off in the boat. And so Mark tells us how the people respond in verses 33 to 34. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. So the people take off running on foot, following the boat's trajectory path. More than likely, they skirted the lake, crossing the Jordan River at a ford 2 miles north of where the river dumps into the Sea of Galilee. The crowds actually arrive at the area before Jesus and the 12 land on shore. So they beat them there. Now, how I see it, there are really two different ways to look at the multitude arriving here at this place. First, we definitely see an echo of how the disciples interrupted Jesus as he sought solitude. I mentioned this a little bit earlier before. Let's go ahead and take a look at Mark 1. We're going to read verses 35 to 37. Very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Simon and his companions went to look for him, and when they found him, they exclaimed, "Everyone is looking for you." Such is the nature of ministry. The disciples here, they initially believed that the needs of the people really do define the order of the ministry process. But now that they've actually been part of the other side of that, they're on the other side of the ministry, and they've been ministering to others, the 12 better understand that crucial step to power and authority in ministry work for Jesus, and that's time alone with God. Now, I'd like to believe that the 12, as all of these masses of people beat them to the shore and they disembark from the boat, that they have this revelatory moment, right? And they reflect back on their own words earlier to Jesus. But Mark does let us know towards the end of this chapter that they're really not on track with that quite yet. So it's more likely that they're at least in part focused on their own needs, specifically their hunger, which still hasn't been sated, and their weariness from being on mission. But there's another way to look at this multitude. So not only do Jesus and the 12 withdraw into the wilderness, but so too do the multitude. And they don't know it yet, the multitude that is, but they're also engaged in an exodus, a second exodus, to be clear. This is a place of rest and provision in the wilderness. We know this was the case with the first Exodus. I mean, to be honest, I think that Jesus has this multitude in mind when he first sends the 12 out on mission. Like them being out on mission, this is a consequence of that they would come and join them and be in the wilderness with them. Which means that not only is Jesus not surprised by this great multitude, I'm sure that the disciples are, but Jesus is not. Not only do I think that he's not, but I think this is a planned consequence. He wants them to come. It's an unspoken invitation, as it were. He wooed them out, just as God did in the first Exodus. So what we see here is that right before the Passover, we once again have God providing through the presence of Jesus. And I'm one of those people that strongly believes that wherever God directly, physically interacts with his people in the Old Testament, it's Jesus. More specifically, the Son of God, before he's born to us as Jesus. And so for this is an echo in Jesus' history, that he led the people out the first time in his power, and in his presence he led them through the wilderness, right? The angel of the Lord who goes before them, the rock that's struck. We could go on, but I really want to stay on track here. But that's the Son of God. And now again, Jesus in person, his presence is once again being the one through whom God provides his full provision. It's a great, great promise, once again showing to the people. And this is, of course, happening that in the wilderness, and it's in the wilderness that God reveals his character and his nature through his faithful provision, his protection, and his guidance in the harshest environment. And it's all through Jesus that all of God's will is released. So we see this in the Old Testament, in the Exodus story, and now we're seeing it again here in the great miracle in the wilderness of Bethsaida. Now Jesus, full of compassion, full of grace, he calls them, the people, sheep without a shepherd. And he has this compassion that he has for him, splanchnizomai, which is the Greek word for that. It really does have a unique presence in the New Testament. In every case, it is solely used to describe God's reaction to our brokenness. In all but one instance, it is used to describe Jesus' reaction directly. And the only time that it's not is when Jesus is using it to describe, in the parable of the prodigal son, how the Father, God, how he is moved when he sees his wayward son return. So compassion from a New Testament perspective, then it's God-defined and God-modeled. Now, seeing the people as sheep without a shepherd, it really, there are two things in play at the same time. It's a commentary on the current religious establishment's failure to instruct the people on God's word, and it's also that connection back to Exodus once again. As to this first part, the failure on the part of the shepherds whom God had appointed, the last time that we read in the Old Testament that the religious leaders teach God's word and guide them in how to remain in God's fellowship is like 470 years earlier, and it's done through the direction of the priest and scribe Ezra, and we read about this, of course, in Nehemiah 8. The religious leaders in Jesus' time were so much more interested in teaching the people to obey tradition and commentary on Mosaic law, and we've talked about this a whole lot already. They saw shepherding God's people as being superior to the people, and the elites actively separated themselves from the people. So the sheep in their mindset are meant to serve the shepherds. But that's not how God sees the role of the shepherd with regard to his people. Shepherds, we know that they lead their sheep to food and water and rest. They carry the sheep unable to keep up with the rest of the flock. They seek out sheep who have wandered away or gotten lost, and they protect the sheep from predators and thieves. It's a dirty, messy job, and it's hard. And this is why God rebukes the religious shepherds of Israel through the prophet Ezekiel in Ezekiel 34, verses 2 through 6. Son of man, prophesy against the shepherds of Israel. Prophesy and say to them, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Woe to you, shepherds of Israel, who only take care of yourselves. Should not shepherds take care of the flock? You eat the curds, clothe yourselves with wool, and slaughter the choice animals, but you do not take care of the flock. You have not strengthened the weak, or healed the sick, or bound up the injured. You have not brought back the strays, or searched for the lost. You have ruled them harshly and brutally. So they were scattered because there was no shepherd, and when they were scattered, they became food for all the wild animals. My sheep wandered over all the mountains and on every high hill. They were scattered over the whole earth, and no one searched or looked for them. Now again, Ezekiel is prophesying this against the leaders in Jerusalem about 600 years before Jesus has come to shepherd the people now out on the outskirts of Bethsaida. And in that case, Jerusalem had already fallen for the first time, and Ezekiel is prophesying against the religious leaders. And even after all that had happened, all the exile, the years of exile, and the destruction of much of Israel and Judea, and most ostensibly Jerusalem, God still sees that the people are still without a shepherd. Even after all that had happened and their ancestors had walked through, even now, in light of all that, the people are still without a shepherd. Now, as to the Exodus, at the very near end of Moses' life, Moses prays to the Lord that he provide the people with a leader to guide them from the wilderness to the promised land. Let's go ahead and look at Numbers 27, verses 15 to 17. Moses said to the Lord, may the Lord, the God who gives breath to all living things, appoint someone over this community to go out and come in before them, one who will lead them out and bring them in. So the Lord's people will not be like sheep without a shepherd. Jesus, of course, is the ultimate answer to Moses' prayer. It is worth noting, however, that God chose Moses' aide as a successor, and we know Moses' aide's name is Joshua. He would have been known among his people as Yeshua or Yehoshua. And what we have to know about Jesus is that the name Jesus is the anglicized version of the Greek, which is Iesus, right? Iesus. And that, of course, is derived from the Hebrew Yeshua or Yehoshua. And that, of course, means God is salvation, which is a perfect description of our Messiah. So in this, we see that the one whom God chose to lead the Israelites into the promised land is in fact a foreshadow of the one, Jesus, who ultimately leads God's people to the ultimate promise, right? The ultimate promise, it's not a land, it's God. And it's a restoration to fellowship with God and family with God and citizenship in his kingdom as his beloved sons and daughters. Now, Mark shows us how Jesus immediately begins to shepherd the people, first by teaching them. Now, Luke tells us that Jesus teaches them about the kingdom of God. Mark says many things. Luke and Matthew add that Jesus healed many in need. So you can well imagine that this takes time, and this sets the stage, of course, for the next level of wilderness rest. Let's go ahead and continue with our story in Mark 6. We're going to be looking at verses 35 to 38. By this time it was late in the day, so his disciples came to him. This is a remote place, they said, and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat. But he answered, you give them something to eat. They said to him, that would take more than a half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much on bread and give it to them to eat? How many loaves do you have? He asked. Go and see. When they found out, they said, 5, and 2 fish. Now we see in this exchange between Jesus and his disciples really a contrast in 2 different perspectives. The disciples are focusing on what they see, right? And what do they see? They see the remote location, the mass of people, and the impending crisis that will happen when the resources cannot possibly meet the needs of all these people. And this is not the first time that God has been presented with this type of a crisis. Let's go ahead and look back again at the Exodus in first Numbers 11 verses 13 to 14, and then Numbers 11 verses 21 to 22. Where can I get meat for all these people? They keep wailing to me, give us meat to eat. I cannot carry all these people by myself. The burden is too heavy for me. But Moses said, here I am among 600,000 men on foot, and you say, I will give them meat to eat for a whole month? Would they have enough if flocks and herds were slaughtered for them? Would they have enough if all the fish in the sea were caught for them? Yeah, the location is different, and the scale is much larger for Moses in this iteration, but otherwise, doesn't this sound exactly like the disciples? Now, we really don't know the heart posture of the disciples here. Maybe they really are concerned for the well-being of the masses. After all, the people who are here, they came from the villages where the 12 went out and ministered to them. And then again, maybe the disciples are hungry and weary and they really just want that rest that Jesus has promised. Maybe both. We really don't know what their heart posture is in all of this. But Jesus responds to their really pragmatic assessment of what is possible here. And what does he do? He intensifies the potential for crisis by saying, you give them something to eat. And this exchange really does bring up another truth about serving God. He doesn't ask us about our lack, what don't you have, when he calls us to serve his people. If you remember from 2 weeks ago, we talked about how Moses was telling God how he really isn't the right one, the right messenger to be sent to Pharaoh and to lead the Israelites away from Egypt, and how God responds to that in Exodus 4:2. Moses tells God what he doesn't have, and God responds by asking Moses about what he does have, which in that case was a staff. Now in the wilderness outside of Bethsaida, Jesus responds to the disciples' lack of money and food by asking a very similar question. What do you have to feed the people? If you remember from Jesus' instruction to the 12, Jesus told them not to carry any extra money or any extra food, which means they don't have anything, right? Now, the disciples can only see what they don't have. So they first see what is impossible about the situation, and then they also see what they don't have. And then they get analytical on Jesus, right? It would take more than a half a year's wages, they say. Now, day laborers earned a denarius for a day's work. So if you subtract out all the Sabbaths, day laborers typically earned about 200 denarii in a year's time. So the disciples estimate that it would cost more than 100 denarii to buy food for the masses. Now, John's gospel elaborates on this point with the disciples protesting that it would cost that much just to provide a nibble for each person. John then tells us that Andrew, the disciple Andrew, is able to scrounge up the meal that a boy's mom packed for him, 5 small barley loaves and 2 fish. And as we talked about in Matthew, the loaves are not even like these lovely plump loaves of bread that we see now in the stores. Eastern loaves were thin and small, more resembling pita bread. And the fish were likely sardines, which the people would use to spread on the bread like relish. This is hardly the makings of a feast for one boy, let alone for an entire mass of people. But it is, however, absolutely the makings of a but God miracle. My favorite phrase, but God. Now, John 6:6 tells us that Jesus already has a plan in mind to feed the people. He just wants the disciples to see the situation from God's perspective, just as God had challenged Moses to do in Numbers 11, verse 23, in response to Moses' earlier complaint. The Lord answered Moses, "Is the Lord's arm too short? Now you will see whether or not what I say will come true for you." So we come back to the disciples having a perspective of how many or how little. And this contrasts with Jesus's how much, right? How many is less important than how much Jesus is. Now, the King of Kings, he then directs his disciples to prepare the people for the banquet to come. Let's go ahead and continue in Mark 6. We're going to read verses 39 to 42. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass. So they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to his disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. Now, we're meant to see here a contrast between Herod's feast and Jesus' feast. These are 2 kings who are hosting 2 feasts, and they have very different outcomes. Take a look at this comparison between the feasts. On the left, you can see how it is characterized by pride and extravagance. The feast, as you might remember from last week, is held at Machaerus, which serves as both John the Baptizer's prison and execution site, and also as one of the royal Herodian palaces. Antipas invites his advisors, military leaders, and the power elite in his tetrarchy. They gathered to celebrate his 49th birthday, which, as we talked about last week, was a decidedly non-Jewish practice. And the party, full of lavish decadence, ends with the execution of an innocent man, John the Baptizer, with his head served up on a platter. That's how the world feasts. In contrast, we now see how King Jesus hosts a feast. The location is humble and simple. They are on the grassy plains in an undisclosed area around Bethsaida. Jesus' inner circle is present here, just like at Antipas's feast. Only here, the disciples are serving rather than being served. And they're serving everyone who has come to the area. None are invited, but all are welcome, and it's their needs that are being met by Jesus and his disciples. Let's not forget that Jesus has already been teaching them about the kingdom and healing their sick all day. The contents of the feast are notably as humble as the king who multiplies them, but all who are gathered are satisfied, and all are treated with compassion. This, my friends, is how the kingdom feasts. Now, Jesus directs the disciples to arrange the people in groups, essentially in tables on the green grassy field. The Greek word for Mark's description of how the people are made to sit is prosia, which literally means by beds and beds, meaning that they sat down or reclined in rows, one by the next, as beds in a garden or a vineyard might be planted. The arrangement undoubtedly helps the disciples distribute the food equally, and as everyone's shorter, lower to the ground than they are, and so they're able to see more people. But there are additional implications besides the practical as this as well. So this too, of course, invokes Moses' own division of the people, whom he grouped under leaders of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. So we are meant once again to see this as a second Exodus, and Jesus as the second and greater Moses, which, if you're with us through Matthew, knows is a central core theme to the book of Matthew. Among the documents that were found at the caves of Qumran about 75 years ago, what we now call the Dead Sea Scrolls, there are scrolls that describe how the true Israel will be assembled in the desert in the last days, and they'll be assembled in groups of 50s and 10s. And so this finding, it really does lend evidence that this feast may also be a foreshadowing of the marriage supper of the Lamb, which of course we see in Revelation 19. And then, of course, there's the very well-known psalm of praise that David writes about Jesus as the Good Shepherd, Psalm 23. Let's go ahead and look at that. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. He makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. Even though I walk through the darkest valley, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup overflows. Surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. If you think about it, really the entire psalm applies to this miracle as well. So Jesus is the true shepherd who turns the wilderness into a place of provision. The people are invited to rest in the grasses led there by Jesus. They're set on the right path through his teaching. They're comforted in healing and provision that's granted through the authority and power of Jesus, his rod and his staff. I look at the promises that are really in the second part of verse 5 and also in verse 6, applying in this moment where they are and outside of Bethsaida, mainly to the disciples in this time. But eventually this is going to be for all of Jesus's disciples, and that includes you and me, of course. The feast is ultimately pointed towards the kingdom, where we are invited to dwell, anointed by the Holy Spirit. Now notice that Jesus does not ask the Father for multiplication. Jesus offers a blessing, a barakot. And this is, of course, to God, thanking him for his food. And we don't really know for sure, but there is a blessing over the bread that the Jewish people speak at every Sabbath meal called the hamotzi. The blessing, which is spoken in Hebrew, it says this. It says, Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam hamotzi lachem min haaretz, which translates to, Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who brings forth bread from the earth. Now, we don't know specifically that Jesus said that or what he said in his prayer of thanks to God, but we do know that Jesus prays differently than how the Jewish people would have prayed and how I see most Christians pray as well. While Jewish people bow their heads while speaking and hearing this prayer, Jesus instead looks up to heaven and gives thanks to the Father. Now, the hamotzi is a blessing that the head of the household, Jesus is the head of our household, he speaks before the bread is broken and then passed to the rest of those at the table. Jesus breaks the bread and gives it to his disciples, who then serve the people. And so we actually see here a foreshadowing of another feast. I want to take you all the way to Mark 14. We're going to read verse 22. While they were eating, Jesus took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to his disciples, saying, Take it, this is my body. So this is the Last Supper, of course, and you knew that. So here Jesus takes the bread, he gives thanks, he breaks it, and he gives it to his disciples. Exactly the same as what happens at the Last Supper. Here, of course, then the disciples bless the people with what Jesus gives them. At the Last Supper, they themselves receive it. Now, the bread and the fish have been consecrated to the service of the kingdom. And there are obvious echoes of the Exodus here as well. Where there was manna and quail, now there are bread and fish. Both types of provision represent Jesus, majestic in the scope of the provision, yet also austere and humble in the composition of the feast. And doesn't that just suit who Jesus is? Majestic in his absolute sovereignty, right? His indisputable sovereignty, yet he's humble in heart. It's Jesus. Now, Mark tells us that all the people ate and were satisfied. And this is a clear expression of Jesus' compassion in releasing the power of God. So what we know about God's provision is that God doesn't stop with what is just enough. He doesn't stop with the merely enough. It's complete and lavish in its giving, right? God is lavish in how he provides. Now, the disciples had complained that it would take a lot of money that they didn't have in order to provide a mere bite of food to each person. But God has multiplied their little to satisfy all. And Mark tells us that the disciples are blessed in this miracle as well. Let's go ahead and finish up with the last two verses of this miracle in Mark 6, verses 43 and 44. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. So here's where the miracle in this situation is even more generous than in the first Exodus. God tells Moses in Exodus 16, verses 4 and 5, that the people were only permitted to gather enough manna to sustain each person for one day, except on the day of the Sabbath, or the day before the Sabbath, rather, where they could gather enough for 2 days. Now, God releases abundant provision in this situation, enough that each disciple can fill a basket. The 12 had been obedient in serving the masses what they themselves needed, all while the masses enjoyed the rest that the 12 had been promised. God is faithful, and he sees to the needs of his disciples personally and abundantly. Now, one of my favorite statements that Jesus makes to his disciples when they gather the leftovers shows up in John 6, verse 12. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So the provision of God, it comes with a responsibility. God wants us to enjoy his prosperity that he gives us, his provision, and he wants us to steward it with wisdom, and wasting does neither. It also shows that God doesn't waste anything that he gives us, nor anything that we give to him, which of course includes our pain, our brokenness, our doubt. He takes all things for the good of those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. He takes our ashes and he instead turns that into beauty and multiplies that beauty. Nothing is wasted with God. Now, I'm not sure that you picked up on this, but Mark actually does not indicate that the people are awestruck or amazed by the miracle provision. And so we're used to reading the accounts of people being amazed by Jesus' teaching and his miracles, but that doesn't show up here. There's no word of that from Mark here. And it very well may be that the people don't even know that there's been a miraculous multiplication. And I bring that up because I firmly believe that the multiplication of what the disciples bring to Jesus is meant to reveal to the disciples the power and the authority and the glory and the character of Jesus. It's for them. The provision is for the people. The demonstration of power is for the disciples. And so we see here yet another example of the hidden revelation of the kingdom. There's a difference between the revelation that outsiders receive from what the insiders receive, right? From what the disciples see. But as we're going to see when we pick up next time, Jesus is revealing this greater revelation, but the disciples are not quite ready to pick it up and understand it and grasp it in the way that he intends. So Mark then buttons up this account by giving us an idea of just how many people have joined Jesus and the disciples in the wilderness. Mark only references the men here, about 5,000. Matthew tells us that women and children were also included. Now, I did this back in Matthew, and so I thought it might be fun to see once again just how massive this miracle truly is. Here are the 4 pictures. I've added another one here showing 5,000, 10,000, 15,000, and 20,000 people. Now, the smallest grouping just represents the men who were counted. The other 3 represent the estimates of women and children added to the men. 5 small thin loaves, 2 sardines, all satisfied, 12 baskets filled with leftovers. The kingdom is at hand. So that's all we're going to do today. That's where we're going to stop. When we pick up next time, we're going to finish chapter 6 with Jesus sending his disciples right after this feast back into the boats. Unlike the earlier trip that we already saw when they go to Decapolis, this time Jesus is not in the boat with them. Thank you for joining me today. You know my heart on this. I want you to be hungry for more and thirsty for more of the Word of God, that this just reveals his character and his nature and his power and his majesty, and you just want more of it. Because when I study it, I come out wanting more. It's all I can do to keep this in a bite-sized amount. So Again, I just pray that blessing over you. I pray that you're doing well. I pray that you are prospering in all the ways that God has promised to you, and that this new season is revealing all of God's goodness to you. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.